All right, it's 4 o'clock. You know what that means. Time to take a look at the stock market. Stocks were positive earlier today, but they took a pretty big hit this afternoon after oil prices started dropping. Let's take a look at how the Dow is doing and check in with MSNBC's David Gura, who joins me now. And David, 927 points, just above 19,000. And it looks like you're now at home. All of these are not good signs for how we're wrapping up the week, though I'm very glad to see that you are safe. What happened today?
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think that investors are still just sort of wrestling with where things stand in terms of the stimulus package. We now have that document in full, about 280 pages, the Republican proposal. Senators are going to take that home this week and read through it. I think a lot of investors are going to be, if not reading through it, looking for the highlights as well. I think people continue to reckon with how grave this is, yes, as a public health crisis, but as a financial and economic crisis as well. So many economists are now saying that we are on the precipice of recession, if not in a recession at this point. We got those employment figures yesterday that portend even worse unemployment figures in the next month, and we know how bad it could be after that. So I think a lot of people just throughout this week have been taking stock, and while we've seen intervention, we've seen central banks trying to do stuff to prop up the market, to try to instill confidence in investors. There's still just folks reckoning with the fact that this is unprecedented and so huge, Allison.
Yeah, David, stocks were on their way to their worst week since 2008. It looks like they pretty much locked that in. And you talk about 2008, I mean, people start thinking recession. You mentioned the economic data that we're going to start getting, because that's the scary thing, right? A week or so ago, we were still getting jobs numbers and economic data that had not reflected really the brunt of the coronavirus and its impact. And you can only imagine that those numbers are going to continue to get worse as more and more people are now home.
Yeah, we got that jobs report this week, and unemployment was up. You know that when this usually happens, the White House is very eager to talk about a jobs report, tout what a jobs report looks like. There's an awareness that what we saw this week is an indication of what's to come, and we're not even fully able to grapple with how big that's going to be. But yes, the economic data is starting to tell us that people are already panicking. People have already lost their jobs. As was reported in the New York Times and other places, just state unemployment agencies are already overwhelmed with folks who've lost their jobs in recent days. And we are only at the beginning of this crisis, in actual fact, Allison.
Yeah, David, something else just to remind folks of, it is Friday. Today was the last day that the stock exchange had traders on the floor. If I'm not mistaken, Monday we will go all electronic?
That's exactly right. So there were 2 individuals who tested positive for COVID-19 at the stock exchange last week. They were tested on Friday, and those results came in 2 days ago. So this is unprecedented. 11 Wall Street is this storied, historic building with a massive trading floor, and there are several thousand fewer people on that floor than there used to be. But day to day, there are people there, direct market makers, traders handling auctions. That's not going to take place come Monday. There was speculation earlier in the week that the market might scale back its hours. That's something the Treasury Secretary brought up. It sounds like that's not going to happen. The exchange pushed back on that, but it will be a new day come Monday with the exchange. A certainly quiet 11 Wall Street, and the president of that exchange really adamant that the contingency plan is in place. They can do all of this without people, but it will be strange. It will be different to see this marketplace operating without people on the floor shouting and yelling, moving about, and conducting those auctions, Allison.
Well, and David, you brought up something really interesting last week, because a lot of people think, oh, come on, so much of the trading is done electronically anyway. The New York Stock Exchange should have gone that way a long time ago. But you brought up something interesting, that on these crazy days, when you're getting near 4 o'clock and people are rushing to get in last minute things, that very often it is the traders on the floor who are running around that paper and making those things happen at the last minute, and that could change if there aren't people there able to get that done.
Yeah, Allison, something you do, which I really appreciate, is we hit 4 o'clock and you wait for the markets to settle. The number that we get at 4 o'clock might not be the number that we get at 4:01 or 4:02. So often there is action after that closing bell. And I think back on last week, from the position where I was broadcasting from, I could see one of these pits and 30, 40 traders descended on it. I wondered how much of it might have been performative to sort of emphasize the fact that there is this human element. But for 20 or 30 minutes, they continued to have this auction to sort of settle the price of some of these stocks. And something that they and something that the exchange's management has said all along is that's a bulwark against volatility, that if you have humans there who can ease things out at the end of the day, that's going to make it a safer, a surer place for investors to trade. They continued to make that argument this week. Ultimately, they lost it. But what the exchange says is this is only temporary. They're going to go back to the way things were. There are plenty of people, though, Allison, who think that once you go past this, once you show that the exchange can operate without people doing what they've been doing, maybe we won't come back.
It was interesting, David, as you were talking, we brought the picture of the Dow up and you could just see the numbers moving a little bit. So for people who are thinking what's going on, that's what we talk about when we say that the markets settle. It might be 405, but just some of those last minute, orders, things getting settled out before the day and the week closes. David, it's so hard because often on a Friday you would talk about, what are traders saying? What do investors think? What could we watch for next week? And I think that's the big thing, right? That nobody really knows. There is no logical pattern to what's going on. There is no way to sort of say, well, this is where the support is, right? Because we talk about this a lot, that there are certain levels of support. You kind of look to certain, whether it's a psychological number on the market or a certain place where it might pause and take a breather. And it just seems like we'll blow through those and bounce back up, and that there's just sort of no logical support here.
Yeah, nobody's able to take a deep breath. And as I was looking at stocks today, there was some movement upward with airlines, with the cruise line industry. I think that stems from the fact that they've seen the draft of this bill. They are cheered or reasonably optimistic that included in that stimulus package is going to be something to support them for some time. But really, it's anyone's guess at this point. Again, politicians continue to talk about how robust that stimulus package is going to be. But until it's passed, we really have no idea. So you have investors reckoning with the magnitude of the public health crisis as they just sort of wait to see what the government is going to do. And as you know, I'm sure having talked to investors, words only get you so far. They want to see the data. They want to see the package when it's all said and done. That's what they're going to be waiting for.
Yeah, people want to have those checks in hand. They want to know what's going on. They need something concrete before they'll really feel confident. David, we have talked to you in so many different locations over the last couple of weeks, whether it's the stock exchange or here in your home. Thank you so much for talking us through all of this uncertainty.
I appreciate it. Stay healthy, Allison. Thank you.
You too. Thanks.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.